This webinar is put on by Team Global and the International Perspective. Team was founded in 1958 as the European Atlantic Movement and is an independent apolitical educational foundation. Team aims to enable young people to act as global citizens and to aspire to leadership roles within their communities. We empower them to consider world issues and to take their part in resolving problems and promoting solutions. We recently established our student-led initiative, the International Perspective, in which a team of students are helping their peers and wider society to be more aware of international issues. Through webinars such as this, we are engaging with students from across the UK to think globally on a range of issues from cybersecurity, global inequality, and in the case of this webinar, the Israeli-Palestine conflict. So as mentioned before, thank you very much to Dr. Toufic Haddad for joining us this evening. He's a social scientist whose work focuses on the political economy of development and conflict in the Middle East and Israel-Palestine in particular. Before joining the Council of British Research in the Levant as the Kenyon Institute's Deputy Director in October 2018, Toufic had an eclectic professional and academic career working as a journalist, editor, researcher, consultant, and a publisher, including for several UN bodies. He has a BA in Philosophy and Middle East Studies from Trinity College, an MA in Near East Studies and Journalism, apologies, from New York University, and a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University London, in Development Studies as well. His PhD into Palestine neoliberalism and nationalism in the occupied territory is published by IB Tauris in 2016 with a paperback edition out in 2018. He is the co-author of 2 additional books and has extensively spoken and published on the Israel-Palestine conflict, featuring an assortment of books, print, television, and online media, both academic and popular. His research has been sponsored by London School of Economics' Middle East Center, the Arab Council for Social Science, and Palestinian American Research, as well as the CBRL. He's also lectured at SOAS and guest lectured at King's College London, the Aga Khan University, and the Birzeit University. Apologies for the butchered pronunciation. Toufic, please, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. It seems like you did your research on me. Good on, bless. Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here, and I'm happy to be able to speak to you today. When someone tries to take on the super complicated issue of the Israel-Palestine conflict and what does the future hold, you're asked to do it in 10 to 15 minutes, it's certainly quite a challenge. So as Chris mentioned, I am an academic, but I have a varied background, so to speak, and I'll try to bring some of those thoughts and ideas into my talk, but I should acknowledge up front that I don't have a crystal ball, and what I'd really like to try to do is sort of identify some of the main vectors and continuities that I think are most important for an audience like this to be able to pay attention to, because at the end of the day, while nobody can really predict the future, we also must be aware of and realize that the present and the future are informed, of course, by the past. Having said that, of course, it's also important to acknowledge that doing so, attempting to articulate a narrative of that past and the informing vectors, or so to speak, is inherently a selective process. So with that set of caveats, allow me to say the following allow me to say the following, shall I say? So, I mean, essentially the 3 main vectors I think that we really need to be paying attention to, in essence, are the first one has to do with Western support, Western intervention, and in the case of Israel-Palestine, and of course, primarily in this case, it's support of the state of Israel. And this is obviously a very important factor that not just today, but obviously played a crucial role in the establishment of the state of Israel. Probably don't need to tell this audience very much, but the Zionist movement was not actually a successful movement until it became an ally of the British imperial interests with the Balfour Declaration. And this support has been key for ever since. And in fact, there was a mutual interest. We'll talk about the Zionist movement a bit later, but protecting the road to India, where India was one of the key places in the British Empire, and Egypt and the Suez Canal were also key. And this region being strategic insofar as one of the main routes that you could go east, where east to west transit took place, that those elements are not going away. The sort of embedded geopolitical strategic factors, and the fact that this region is filled by certainly the Eastern Mediterranean shores and the Southern Mediterranean are Arab, and this region, if you want to go around the Suez Canal, you have to go 6,000 kilometers around Africa, or you have to do something aerial up in Central Asia. But this is the key trade route that is not going away. And for that reason, Western support for the establishment of a state, not only where Asia met Africa, and as a very close stopping point right after the Suez Canal, that importance is, as I said, was not going away, and it played a crucial role. Western support has played a crucial role for Israel's both creation as well as providing the essential political, diplomatic, military, and economic support for the Israeli state since its inception. Now, that does not mean that there is no form of conflict between different Western powers or Western states around how they perceive Israel. There certainly is, and there are certainly problems within within states themselves around these issues, but we'll talk about those later. But certainly when the United States today has provided more than $270 billion worth of aid to Israel since 1967, making it the formidable both economic as well as military powerhouse that it is today, that didn't come from just pure Israeli genius. It came from a very important political, the space for Israel to both exist and develop. Of course, a lot of that strength that Israel has accrued has to do with the research and development prowess, and which 80% of those funds which came from the United States actually, go back and procure U.S. military equipment. But okay, so the Western vector, I think, is obviously important. What happens there will clearly be an important factor in how Israel-Palestine sort of ends up unfolding. The second one is Palestinian nationalism. Palestinian nationalism is not going away. It is a prominent, it goes back to late 19th century when you had formation of sort of urban nationalist movements, and early 20th century in Palestinian cities at the end of the Ottoman period. Some might say that that's quite young, but de facto all nationalisms are actually quite young, and including the Israeli and including, well, I'm not going to speak about British, it's probably opening up a big can of worms there, but in any case, obviously Palestinian nationalism has been irrigated and deepened by the collective memory and history of not only what it went through during late Ottoman and the British Mandate, but of course the experience with the creation of the State of Israel, the creation which in Palestinian historiography is known and termed as the Nakba, meaning disaster. Essentially, a period in Palestinian history where 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated. Of course, you have and 78% of Palestinian land was taken, historical Palestine was taken. Then you, of course, have in 1967, the occupation of the remaining parts of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, in addition to the fact that parts of Syria and the Sinai were also taken over during the 67 conflict. But Palestinian nationalism is not going away. It has made important strides, both diplomatically. You might even consider the British mandate that the British government had actually recognized that there was the right to self-determination for the Arabs of Palestine, because Palestine was considered a Class A mandate, which meant it was closest to independence. Of course, there's a lot to say about what happened there. But certainly, I mean, today when Palestine is considered to be a non-voting observer member state of the United Nations and has had its right to self-determination recognized, and has signed obviously large important international treaties, that this is not going away, but it's certainly being deepened, and it is certainly also being challenged by the situation that is currently going through right now. Okay, so I just want to put that to the side, just as a vector, let's say. The third element that I want to talk about is the question of the Jewish state and the Zionist movement. I don't have time to go back through that, but I think what's important to emphasize here is that the concept of the Jewish state, or even more so as Israel articulates itself, the Jewish democratic state, is something that needs to be proactive and needs to be managed. It didn't happen by chance. It happened only by consequence of war and the events of 1948. It happened through settler colonial imposition. With demographic trends, it also entails somehow either ensuring that you have increased Jewish immigration taking place, or somehow eliminating your Palestinian population, whether that is done, or your non-Jewish population, whether that is done through forms of warfare or forms of elision, I would argue, forms of gerrymandering, which is, I would argue, the scenario that we are in today. In the Oslo process, with this very complicated, quote unquote, Swiss cheese nature of the Israel-Palestine, with all these different kinds of areas A's, area B, area C, East Jerusalem, Gaza, H2. A veritable alphabet soup has been created in the last 28 years by the peace process. Now, so putting all those elements to one side, I think obviously the key point here about mentioning this sort of three moving vectors is certainly the more current period that we're in is informed by the complications and contradictions that emerged after the 1967 war, okay? Basically, where in the course of 6 days, Israel came to occupy a territory that had more than 1 million Palestinians in it. Okay, despite having created about 500,000 Palestinian refugees during the war, still 1 million Palestinian remained in historical Palestine. And this posed an important challenge for Israel in its quote unquote Jewish democratic nature and state. Essentially, if they gave citizenship to this population, it would erode the quote unquote Jewish character of the state. And if they didn't give citizenship to this population, it would quote unquote erode the quote unquote democratic character of the state. And this is a structural contradiction and problem that remains, and Israel constantly needs to be able to mediate it, manage it, and process it somehow. And the period that we're in today is largely structured by the agreements reached between the PLO and Israel in 1993, known as the Oslo Accords, which were a veritable attempt to try and manage this contradiction, this dilemma, I would argue, which was a dilemma for Israel primarily, and then of course a dilemma for Western states at the same time, particularly in the context of the fact that you had the first intifada taking place, where direct Israeli rule of the territories was seen as unviable in the long term, because Israel could not manage the local Palestinian cities. Their strategy and their actual historical strategy for managing this contradiction came out of a military plan that Yigal Allon came up with in 1967, basically a month after the June War, where he basically came up with what's known as the Allon Plan, where he essentially said, we have to take what we want from these areas and we have to leave what we don't want. What they wanted were the mountaintops, the water, the land, anything that was military strategic, such as the Jordan Valley, anything that was ideologically significant, such as Hebron or Jerusalem, or sites where they believed the ancient Israel civilization existed, and so forth. What they didn't want was, of course, the non-Jewish population, this Palestinian population that was increasingly rebellious. And the dilemma there was always, what do you do with them? So, so the solution that Alon proposed was that this should be given to Jordan, and we should get some sort of Arab partner to be able to, local partnership is the way to do it. But they didn't obviously want to, at the time, initially, acknowledge a Palestinian national project. Okay, they wanted to go through intermediary countries. That failed with the ascent of the PLO. There was also several attempts to create collaborator networks known as the Village Leagues under Menachem Begin in the late 1970s. This was never also, with the PLO also being strong, this was never seen as a really viable strategy. And under certain circumstances, that arose at in the early 90s because of a unipolar hegemonic Western US leading role after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the decline of third worldism and the non-aligned movement, so to speak. There were appropriate historical circumstances emerged where Israel could envision that a weakened and a bankrupting Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO leadership, would be willing to play this role in the occupied territories to oversee governance and autonomy of the occupied territories, to do that role that Israel couldn't do, and that the West didn't want Israel to be able, because the West didn't want to be in the position of having to defend Israel, acting like sort of bullies is a light term. I mean, there was, close in the memory was the experience of South Africa, also the idea of continued prolonged direct occupation inside the cities, Israeli soldiers running around refugee camps and trying to stop kids or arrest kids through throwing stones, just was not a position that the West wanted to be in. So local governance through an autonomy arrangement was the scenario that they were trying to implement. Now, Oslo was exactly that. Okay, the Oslo Accords do not mentioning the words occupation. There is no official recognition of any Palestinian rights in them. They are largely security arrangements. 2/3 of the appendices of them have to do with where the powers that the Palestinian security services were to have and not have, of course. In addition to, let's say, very important, the economic powers that the Palestinian Authority would be able to have. And here it's important to emphasize that, of course, the Palestinians did not have any serious economic powers. Israel controlled all the borders of the country, overall from the river to the sea. And then, of course, the Area A's, which composed 20% of the West Bank, divided across 8 or 9 different islands in the West Bank, in addition to the other island of Gaza in the south. Now, a key part of the Oslo Accords is the assembly, is the actual structure of it. The structure being the 5-year period, what was known as the interim period, where the Palestinian Authority would be created, and where the idea that Palestinian governance could be sort of established, and certainly, of course, most importantly, the security services. And final status negotiations, where the real conflictual issues between Israel and Palestine were supposed to be determined, were kicked to final status negotiations more than 5 years. They were supposed to be 5 years. They ended up being around 7 years. And this is where you have the real political issues of the Israel-Palestine conflict coming to a front. We're talking about what happens with the refugees, what happens with Palestinian statehood, what happens with the settlements, what happens with Jerusalem, what happens with the water. Okay, so basically it was an arrangement to kick the real issues of the conflict to the long grass 5-7 years from now. And then in the interim, in the early period, you create this structure, okay, of the Palestinian Authority, which was this governance structure. And that's exactly what happened. Now, basically, after the creation of the authority, I would argue that Israel basically, now, it's way too complicated for me to go into the details of what exactly happened and the narratives and counter-narratives, but I would argue that structurally, Israel was in a position, once it pocketed its main goals of the Oslo process, that being the creation of an autonomy arrangement for this Palestinian population, it had no incentive to move towards final status negotiations, okay? And I would further argue that the West actually would probably back Israel up on that, because fundamentally Israel is a Western ally in a region where the West lacks reliable allies. And we saw from the Arab uprisings that took place starting in 2011 that if somebody in Tunisia decides to burn himself in the middle of a market, demonstrations could spread one day all the way to Bahrain, and all of a sudden 21 different Arab prime ministers or presidents or kings are could potentially be overthrown. And that's a dangerous situation for the West, because you don't know what's going to come up, and you don't know what their politics are going to be, and they haven't always had the best relationships with this region, etc. I don't need to go into that. Essentially, that structural arrangement led to a situation where, okay, once the Palestinians felt they didn't get what they wanted out of the final status negotiations, and once Israel didn't de facto put really anything on the table for the Palestinians that recognized their main rights around the main issues, including statehood, including right of return, including Jerusalem, including getting rid of settlements, then they had no alternative, and the situation was explosive, and essentially an uprising erupted. For the next 5-7 years, you had this what's known as the Second Intifada erupting, in which Israel essentially attempted to consolidate the map of where the Palestinian Authority would be allowed to be, and sort of really clamp down and tighten the screws on all the security arrangements. Of course, building the wall, of course, building this massive checkpoint system, and of course also building parallel infrastructure for the settlements, which was also key here, because previous to Oslo, settlers used to have to go directly through the Palestinian cities to reach their settlements, whereas now an entirely separate road system has been built, and in fact a de facto entirely separate system, both for Palestinians and for Israelis, exists, even though they are neighbors living in the same territory. However, if the Palestinian commits a crime in one place and in the West Bank, he will be charged by a military court, whereas if an Israeli settler is charged for the same crime, he will be charged by a civil court. Now, we have a word for this, and it was known as separate but different apartheid. This is the belated conclusion of all the main international human rights organizations, whether it's Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or even the Israeli B'Tselem. And this is something that's objectively, at this stage, difficult to deny. So what I would argue is that nothing has really been solved by the situation, by certainly the Oslo process. In fact, what we see instead, and I would argue, if I'm to answer the question of what happens, what is the future of Israel-Palestine, it will be determined by what begins to happen on the main three vectors that I mentioned, both in the West, in Israel, and the question of the Jewish state, Jewish democratic state as well, and what happens inside Palestinian nationalism. Of course, their relational interaction between one another, which is not known. But we can say several things from this. We can say that, I would argue that you could say that in the context certainly of the Arab uprisings, Israel is seen as a increasingly valuable ally and asset to Western powers. That doesn't mean that's across the board. As I said, there are questions of how, for instance, particularly between the Europeans and the Americans, and within the Europeans themselves, what is the best way to manage this Israel ally that the West has over there? Is it under the Trump administration, it was to give them pretty much what they wanted. Others say, why prevent a Palestinian state? What's the problem with having a Palestinian state, or even more Palestinian autonomy, or even a functional Palestinian economic system? Whereas fundamentally, what I call the politics first wing of the donor community is ascendant. And they, of course, assert security as the primal thing. But behind security is actually the imposition of this separate governance apartheid-like arrangement, but, and of which of course provides time and space for continued settlement activity, which is key from the Oslo process. So we have today, even though when the Oslo process started, 150,000 settlers in the occupied territories, now we have almost 700,000. So time here is an asset. And in fact, Martin Indyk, who was a former ambassador to US ambassador to Israel, basically just wrote a book with around Henry Kissinger. And he basically said that Kissinger was not saying land for peace, he was talking about land for time. Basically, time was the essence, because if you give Israel time, you give it time to make it stronger, to put chips on the board, and essentially fragment the Palestinians and make things a fait accompli on the ground. So in the Western sphere, we also see, as I said, sort of the geopolitical situation is not, or strategic significance is not going away. And in fact, it's going to be more competitive between the West and China over who has influence over this intermediary region. In addition to regional players who are also vying, whether it's Iran or Turkey, or regional players, the Arab people and Arab democratic aspirations, which is also a very important vector out there. We also see polarization taking place within inside Western states, which I think is important to acknowledge, particularly the way the Trump administration made, quote unquote, Israel a partisan issue. Where previously you had the Republican and Democratic parties both sort of declaring, unrestricted support for Israel. Now you have elements of the Democratic Party, and particularly Biden today, who has to actually appeal to parts of the left. He's not appealing to the center or the right. He needs to appeal to the left because the large divisions and polarization that were created under Trump, under Corona, under the inequalities that emerged, particularly after 2008 and Corona, put Israel in the middle here. And so you see a bit of the fraying on the social basis and even within the political structures of power, including the Democratic Party, but nothing hardcore happening quite yet. On the Palestinian front, I think from a Palestinian perspective, so in this larger scenario and arc that I've more or less articulated, you can see that Palestinians have simply gotten less and less. They're getting more and more ghettoized. I saw a statistic the other day from 2008, the amount of international funding that has come to the Palestinian Authority has decreased 85%. Within the Palestinian Authority areas where the majority of Palestinians reside, there is a fixed amount of land there. So land prices are skyrocketing. You have the Palestinian Authority itself, which de facto is actually a governance structure run by Fatah, with the main leading Palestinian party. They have essentially attempted to establish a political and economic monopoly over the Palestinian Authority areas for obvious reasons. Maybe if they're not obvious, we can talk about them. But they would like to be the key player in town in there, and obviously ensure that there's no such thing as any leakages that are decreasing their power. But we have also seen the breakdown of the Palestinian Authority in a de facto splitting off of Gaza. Here, I would argue that the Gaza Strip basically represented the largest set and concentration of contradictions of the Oslo process that were simply unsustainable within the Oslo arrangement. When you talk about a place that has, as we know, the poverty is through the roof, everybody is food dependent, 99% of the water is not drinkable, everyone's a refugee there, and they can't go anywhere, then obviously you have explosive conditions that exist there. And the Oslo what Oslo was essentially a conflict resolution scenario, but it's basically emerged into a conflict management scenario, and it couldn't manage Gaza. So because what Oslo did was created all the different islands of the pockets of the Palestinian Authority areas, even though Gaza is traditionally seen as the smaller territorial base in comparison to the much larger West Bank, truth be told, it was the largest of the islands of the archipelago of Palestine that was created by the Oslo process. Okay, if that makes sense. I'm sorry, we can clarify things, but obviously I'm trying to get through as much as I can with this. So Gaza broke off and it was unsustainable. And the international community does not have a solution for it right now. They do at this time have a quote, whether it's not a partner, Hamas is not a partner, but they do have a unified government that's been able to manage the situation there. But do they have a unified governance body in the West Bank? And will they have it with the continued problems that the West Bank poses? And here I would argue, I'm not really sure. So even though it articulated itself as a Hamas-Fatah split, which was indivisible from what happened, it was also a geographical split that also could be articulated in different ways in the West Bank, I would argue. And particularly in a context like you have in the West Bank, where this monopoly position of Fatah there, where you do not have clear leadership, and Fatah is led by a patrimonial, neo-patrimonial leader like Abu Mazen, who was 86 years old, and Fatah has a bunch of vying potential economic and security elites who may or may not be in or out in the next round once Abu Mazen goes. So the possibility of the political fragmentation adding to the geographic fragmentation of the West Bank is, I would argue, a real possibility in the West Bank. In addition to, and political institutions and organizations would be challenged to be able to absorb the political, the energies that would be released in this, I would argue, because the situation, all the vectors of it for the Palestinian, on the Palestinian Authority side, in the OPT side, are simply getting worse and worse. And when you look at demographic trends, economic trends, political marginalization trends, etc., economic trends. So what else do I want to say here? Israel, or the Israel factor. We saw certainly a kind of, in the last few years, and certainly since the Second Intifada, an increasing power and hubris on behalf of Israel, I would argue. The pronunciation of the religious and national identity of within Zionism at the expense of the historical, quote unquote, socialist, laborist, centrist articulation of Zionism. I would argue here that the Labour Party's historical role was finished with the creation of the establishment of the State of Israel. And then the forces and dynamics, ideological, political, and even economic, once the establishment of the state took place, then began to articulate themselves and use the State of Israel to pronounce this new identity of Israel underneath, of course, this larger umbrella of what the West provides Israel in terms of a non-sufficiently critical engagement with Israel. And certainly in the larger context of a post-9/11 world, where Israel has also used its research, development, and military capabilities to be able to carve a key niche for itself in certain forms of tested military equipment and surveillance technology. Everyone around Israel was able to globalize itself through the Oslo peace process, making relations with China and India, and then beginning to, so it has a market, and anyone who's in power wants some of that technological good stuff and military techniques that Israel can provide. And Israel is very aware of that and certainly attempts to leverage that. But at the same time, you have big problems emerging for Israel. Not emerging. I mean, I think what we saw in the latest uprising war eruption of conflict in May around Jerusalem, but also in Gaza, was you saw new trends which were taking place, which were quite important, which was with the increased fragmentation of the Palestinian people after post-Oslo and of their body politic, we saw a potential for a new form of collective Palestinian mobilization emerging. Now, part of the problem for the Palestinians is not only leadership and tactics and strategy, which I think they have a lot of challenges around, but the fact is that Israel governs Palestinians across Palestine in different ways. And that character to the local form of governance that Israel directs towards Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Palestinians in Gaza, or Palestinians in East Jerusalem, whatever, changes the nature of the fight back, so to speak. So, but at the same time, the taking place of the May 18th general strike and the fact that we saw a form of pan-Palestinian solidarity taking place in the context of a much larger situation potentially creates a new scenario that could emerge. Of course, a key important thing to talk about is what's also taking place in the Western arena on the ground, I think, which is with the polarization and some of the mobile, the solidarity forces and pro-Palestine forces that we have seen emerging in certain parts of I mean, from a Zionist perspective, you see Zionist groups speaking openly about parts of Western Europe being entirely lost. And so their reliance is upon forms of elites and their association with institutions there. We also see some dynamics beginning to happen in the US there. So where do I put all this together? I think I've sort of tried to articulate a general sense of what's been going on and the vectors that are moving. I think the main issue that we have is sort of there's a bit of people, particularly the Western community, falling asleep at the wheel, being confident in their conflict management structures, and hopefully at less and less cost, be it political or economic. But at a certain point, something comes up in an unpredictable fashion that could ignite the whole region and change an equation, and it would change the entire situation. Until then, perhaps the situation, status quo, could continue, but that is also not something that is particularly enviable or likable. We're talking about a situation that is in Gaza, looks like a form of, a barbaric ghettoization of 2 million people. You have in East Jerusalem right in front of me, active context of attempting to push thousands of people out. There are more than 100,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem alone who exist in buildings that are not do not have the correct paperwork in it. And that means Israel can come any time of the day and actually bulldoze these people out of their properties. So an explosive, combustible situation exists here at all times. It is impossible to be able to predict when and how this takes place. A lot of that, or when, but it certainly is possible. And some of the larger historical tendencies are also very dangerous in terms of what we see. I need to probably wrap up, but but with, I guess I mean, with the pronunciation of such a strong variant of Zionist religious nationalism that is coming to the front, which continues to need to manage its Jewish democratic dilemma. Those are scary harbingers from a Palestinian perspective in a context where Israel has actually recently just lost the demographic war, so to speak, and less than 50% of the people, of the 13 million people between the river and the sea, are actually Jewish here. So that's why gerrymandering the borders is so important. But at a certain point, when you gerrymander so much, people say, call a spade, and they say that's apartheid. And that puts you in another political situation. So I guess what I'm trying to say, the conflict management scenario has not been, is a bit of an ostrich sticking their head in the sand scenario. And that leaves you exposed to getting bitten from behind, so to speak. And it could have a lot of dangerous implications for everyone locally and regionally. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Toufic. Plenty to unwrap there, and thank you for the amazing conclusion there. So we'll head into the Q&A session now. We've had a few questions come in already, which is brilliant. Thank you very much. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll pass them on to Toufic. So I'll start with Hannah's question. She mentions, obviously, with former Prime Minister Netanyahu leaving his role in recent years, do you feel that there's the future is brighter for Israel-Palestine under now Prime Minister Bennett, or with the smile, perhaps maybe not so much?
No, I mean, look, Netanyahu's ascendant and his control of power was long-standing, and he was able to his constituents to raise them up, and he pronounced a lot of their politics and identitarian and economic interests. But obviously, Israel is a very complicated society. They are much more united around the common colonial project and the army. But that doesn't mean a Russian and an Iraqi Jew get along, you know, and or one who's from France or wherever. So you're in this situation where it polarized Israel enough that essentially the people who are against Netanyahu essentially created a broad coalition amongst themselves. But that broad coalition included people from the far right, and as well as the far left in the Jewish Zionist perspective, and then also even the Palestinian Arab Party, which is the first time we actually see them in power and thing. So what you can say about that is, I think that Bennett, because of the constraints and the narrowness of his political coalition, actually does not have the ability to do too much in terms of bigger game things, in terms of like leading a bold initiative one way or another, because he would lose, and to say nothing of his interest or desire to do so. But because of that, it actually might act as certainly he needs to pay off his constituents or his coalition partners to keep them happy and to keep himself in power. But there are a lot of thorny issues that can raise along the way. And if he needs to make a tough decision, he could easily lose his power. And Netanyahu has been able to maintain his own base. Since then, he has not allowed the ascendance of any other competing Likud members, which is significant. And and the most important thing to actually answer, I can't remember her name but there has been no sense at all of any attempt to recognize the sources of the conflict, or to go back to negotiations, or to go back to any kind of conflict solution scenario. It's in fact, it's the opposite in general. I mean, Netanyahu was seen as the one who made successful the invisibilization of the Palestinians, with the exception of the few who can get permits into Israel as workers, or, you know, here and there, good Arab, so to speak. But fundamentally, he was seen as somebody who sort of brought security to the streets. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was successful at all. I mean, there are many factors that were at play. And I would argue Israeli politics is not entirely determined anyway between Likud or Labor or anyone else. It's much more determined by the army, which actually is the main force which enforces the systematic control, certainly of the Palestinians. There's obviously much you can say about Israel and its economy, which and also is linked to the economy, but I don't have time to go into it. So nothing to look forward to in terms of the Bennett thing. But what you can say also about it is that the real thing is not when Bennett came into power, but it's really when Trump got out of power. And basically, so when Biden comes in, he saw it as problematic from an American strategic perspective that Israel became the partisanal issue. And so he wanted to try and both bring Israel back into the fold, bring the Democratic Party back into the fold with sort of Israel as a centrist issue. He hasn't actually been successful in doing that at all. And he also wanted to cool down the pace, I would argue, as Gregory Isaacs once said. Anyway, joke aside, the point is that it cooled down the pace of what the Netanyahu-Trump love fests was heading towards, because they were, I think basically Biden came into power, and all of a sudden these settler groups were just, trying to kick out our neighbors over here, and basically that led to a war, a conflagration. Biden didn't need that, and he didn't need that now. In fact, the neighborhood where we're located, it's right in front of all the European and embassies and the Quartet and the UN and the Red Cross. I mean, it was in front of everybody to see. So I think basically the US administration basically told Bennett, cool down the pace. They've promised the Palestinians a whole world of things, a lot of which haven't come through, but no need. And Bennett's own internal considerations also means that he doesn't have that much policy space to do too much. But it's also important to acknowledge that the existing situation right now is unsustainable, okay? From a Palestinian perspective, whether it's Gaza or East Jerusalem, the settlement, settlers and the settlements in the West Bank. So that's what I'm trying to basically say. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Toufic. And thank you to Hannah for the question. The second one comes in from Lordana, and she asks, the two-state solution, in regards to that, do you believe that this is a viable solution long-term? And if so, how can other international territories influence conflict resolution between Gaza and Israel? What would it take, given the West, particularly, as you say, is overly reticent?
I'm not sure how to answer that. There were a bunch of questions in there, but I'll say the following. Yes, I would say there's a question, is it viable or is it desirable? Or is it, I mean, they're totally separate things. Viability, people don't say, okay, the West Bank is split up a million ways, but okay, so what? That doesn't mean you can't take down settlements or take down walls or take down military camps, and you can disengage. That requires political will. But where is that political will going to come from? It's not going to come from within the Israeli polity. It's the Palestinians don't have enough military power right now to do that, but parts of them think that they might at some stage. Is there another political or military force that could articulate itself and pressure Israel? Maybe. I would argue if the situation regionally or internationally became much more crescendoed somewhat, you might have a situation where Israel was, if sort of apartheid South Africa scenario emerged, where Israel was sort of isolated, and in the same way South Africa was, it might be possible, but I'm not sure. The question is, viability is one thing, but desirability is another. And I would argue, is it really desirable to establish a two-state solution? Or is it, parts of me argue this, because I mean, you have a very part of Palestinian nationalism and the experience of the past 70 years has been about this issue of grievance and dispossession and loss of land. And this is not going to go away. Let's remember that the PLO actually was established in 1964, before the 1967 occupation. So the modern articulation of the Palestinian national movement began before 1967, before even the idea of a two-state solution was even born. Now, so and it's deeply embedded in Palestinian identity. Now, and Palestinians see no reason why they should they should give up that formative element of their rights just so that Israel can sort of basically pocket the gains of its ethnic cleansing campaign and its attempt to establish a Jewish democratic state that would never accept a non-Jewish full citizenship, you know, and there's no reason, and I think there are important moral and political questions there. So I think what's more important is to look in broader terms about other forms of potential political solutions. But at the same time, I think it's also, including a one-state one, but at the same time, I think it's also important. I'm very cautious of the tendency in recent years to say, okay, the two-state solution is over, mainly because the two-state solution was anyway, from a Palestinian perspective, seen as a big compromise from the Palestinians. Fair enough. It's not about from a Palestinian perspective, but basically PLO used to say, look, we want liberation of all of Palestine. It's our right. We're from there. Let us go back. Give us our rights and let us establish a state. Okay. So, however, they were convinced there was a important political shift in the mid-70s where the Palestinians basically said, Palestinian leadership said, we're willing to go for a two-state solution on the 22% of remaining Palestine, but just give it to us, okay? And in fact, that was the international consensus pressuring the Palestinians to do that. They accepted that. They went down the track of Oslo, and then they didn't get that. So there's a sense of betrayal around the two-state solution from the Palestinians, okay? And that's why you see it shifting in the other direction. But on the other side of the coin, you have this phenomena where if you can't get the international community to pull out settlements, which are considered a war crime, and in fact, there are tribunals that are in process of being created in the Hague right now around the question of settlements, which is the transfer of a population to deliberately alter its demographic composition, which Israel is clearly doing on a state-sponsored level, not just a non-state level. Then if you can't get the international community to actually force Israel to get the settlers out, how are you actually going to force them to give you equal citizenship in a one state? So I don't have clear answers, but I know the answers will not come from inside the Israeli polity in and of itself, because right now there's no incentives for it. Right now they're sitting on top of the spoils of both the different wars that they were able to win, but also the attitude of the Western states, which sort of let Israel get away with a lot and never really held their foot to the fire on issue, because ultimately they were the ally in the region for them, you know. And so again, it's a systemic instability and conflict that we're heading towards, which is getting more and more dangerous, I would argue.
Brilliant. Thank you, Toufic. Just cautious of time, so perhaps I've got a couple questions left, so perhaps we can do a quick fire few questions. One comes in from Michael, and he asks, are Israel's policies towards Palestine likely to change in any way as a result of the changing demographic balance between Arab Israeli and Jewish Israeli populations, as you mentioned?
I think they already changed. I mean, Israel a couple of years ago, maybe 2018, saw the writing on the wall of where all these trends were going, including the trends amongst Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Arab Israelis, as they're sometimes referred to. And they passed what they called the nation-state law, which basically said that only Jews have the right to self-determination here. There will be no recognition of anything non-Jewish around here, basically, and basically asserting that it was going to maintain Jewish supremacy, despite its democratic character, supposedly. Now, here's something actually quite important to recall. Jewish democratic state concept, the democratic character or the democratic part of that articulation was about mediating internal Jewish Zionist differences. It was not about inclusion of non-Jews in a democratic fold. Okay, so early Zionist thinkers were very clear about this, that, you know, it was important, if you wanted to make Israel succeed, that you needed to bring in different Jewish communities and bring them onto the project, get their buy-in to the project. So it couldn't be seen as just one set of Jews over another set of Jews. Okay, and that's why democratic mediation was important, but non-Jews, forget about it. That's the point. And in fact, that wall has become much harder. For a certain while, Israel was able, and to some extent still now, it's able to tolerate certain elements of a minority, but within semi-liberal boundaries. But we see actually the tendency going the other direction as the conflict doesn't end, as they need to assert and maintain themselves and strengthen themselves and consolidate themselves from within. Do I see any new policies coming out of them, if that was the question, or how they? I think it's all there. I don't see anything so particularly new. I see continuation of status quo ante and as it goes on today. However, there are many factors that are little minefields, and together with which can erupt spontaneously, unpredictably, but also longer term trends that are also very important. And here I would argue the polarizing trends in the West are important, and you have also the trends in the Arab world, which are very important. People may think that the Arab revolutionary process is entirely over, or it's been capped or controlled or whatever, but I see, and I think many analysts would probably agree with me, is that the Arab world is going through a major historical, structural shift that is not exceptional to the Arabs. Europe went through it themselves, and we are just in one phase of it, where it's early revolutionary gusto, or went through a couple of articulations of it, but all the elements are there, and nothing has entirely been solved there. So you have, that's another huge important trend that's going on. You've got the longer term trends, and you've got the short term explosive issues that are going on. And that's, I guess, what will be determining the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Toufic. I'd invite Nathan onto the mic just for the penultimate question. Nathan, you still there?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks Toufic and Team Global for exploring such an important issue today that I feel is increasingly not top of mind. My question is two parts, Toufic. Firstly, do you see China playing a constructive role in the region in future? And secondly, what can we as individuals do to contribute to an increasingly peaceful Israel-Palestine?
Well, thank you for your questions, Nathan. First question, China, is it a constructive role? Well, I'm not like any major imperial power that still needs to get its products to markets and also certainly access resources. It's a bit, whether it's good. Okay. At the end of the day, I mean, constructive or not, constructive for what? At the end of the day, it is a major political, geostrategic competitor to the West here, and they will be fighting over the central territory, even though the sphere of influence, so to speak, of China towards the Middle East is a bit more, they cover a lot of ground in that area, from China all the way to East Africa, I would argue, and certainly the Middle East. And certainly Israel-Palestine is in the center of it. Now, Israel was clearly flirting with China in terms of potentially giving military sales. Also, Israel was potentially trying to, there was important port development projects as well as potential rail projects that were going to take place between Israel and Chinese manufacturers as part of One Belt, One Road idea. The Americans voiced concerns over some of them have been stopped, certainly any military transfer. And actually under Trump, because a lot of the deep state in America was actually playing an important role in articulating Trump's policy, Trump actually had a strong relationship with Israel on this issue, because he was like, look, we are giving you all this money. We made you who you are. We're not going to let you go in the middle of this huge struggle that we're about to be having with China and start giving our technology to them. So they kind of forced Israel to be like, look, you're on our side, and don't. And that's happened before in the past, actually. You know, there was a case of intelligence airplane, as well as a kind of harpoon torpedo that the Israelis were trying to sell to the Chinese. And in fact, just actually a couple of months ago, there was some sort of drone manufacturing thing that was going on, where people who used to work for Israeli drone companies were building the same drones in their garage and selling them to the Chinese or something like that. I mean, it was a kind of an amazing story. Constructive or not? No, I don't see it as anything particularly constructive for Israel-Palestine. You know, I mean, they're not going to challenge America's main sphere of influence here right now. I mean, especially with what's going on South China Seas and Taiwan and whatnot. I think the question of Middle East will come to play in China's big game only after more of what's been happening now takes place. And as long as they have, and we also see, of course, China developing a very important strategic relationship with Iran, which is to include military and economic, and we don't even know what that's about. So that basically is saying that China is going to back Iran in the end for the oil. We'll save your regime and make sure that you don't collapse. That's what it sounds like to me. And you know, at the end of the day, Iran and Israel are regional competing sub-hegemons, competing at the expense of the large local Arab population, I would argue. And so it's not very constructive, I would say. But it is there, but it's not as articulated as it is right now. The Chinese don't want to fight on this issue around Israel-Palestine. Yeah, I would argue. The second question was, what can individuals do? Bless you for asking that question. I think you can do a lot, because I think people are what change history. I mean, it's very, you know, if we study history, it's not, there are institutions and states and all this business, but at the end of the day, when people take power in their hands and put their finger on the issues, important moral and political issues of the day, they can effect change and organize themselves. And I think that possibility exists here. There's no reason why we can't see, and we already do see that taking place. But on some level, I mean, there is a move. Of course, I mean, individuals taking, I don't want to sound mealy-mouthed or mushy. I mean, the question is, what is your politics? What do you stand for? You need to know what you stand for, you know. But I would like to believe that an apartheid agenda is not something that is in the interests of the average Western taxpayer, or that Israel be given all these fancy military toys, basically, to engage in repression of a largely defenseless, stateless refugee people, you know, and that there's something fundamentally immoral about that and wrong, and that Western citizenry and all citizenry, you know, would be much better served rather than having their ruling elites making dirty deals with states for sort of a cruel realpolitik geostrategic economic game. That money could and should be better invested locally in trying to stop inequalities or for other forms of social trigger issues or injustices, or for schools or for hospitals, certainly in the context of a COVID pandemic, you know, where we've seen things like healthcare systems and finances really be an issue around how good your healthcare is, you know. So, and I think this is part of what's driving some of those dynamics on the ground, because when you're in a situation of crisis, as we are in a general sense. I mean, I'm not sure how much folks in the audience know, but I mean, we're in a weird historical period. I mean, ever since 2008, when the major financial collapse took place, it's central banks printing money, you know, and stock markets going crazy. But that's not necessarily stable economic policy, you know. So, and I don't have a crystal ball for what's going to happen there, but certainly when you have a crisis like COVID, pronouncing on top of that an economic crisis and the large inequalities that we see, the question of where your money goes and to who and why are becoming more pronounced questions. And I think in that space, there is a big space for people to speak about human rights, speak about justice, speak about ending this terrible, long-standing conflict that has bloodletted and cost so much money, and because of a lot of, you know, which is against fundamentally the interests of a lot of the citizenry of these, and it's not just cost Israelis and Palestinians, it's cost Westerners and Westerners a lot of money. And I would also argue it's it's probably cost a fair amount of Westerners' lives too, because I mean, Israel-Palestine is certainly the, you know, certainly something that has radicalized large parts of the Arab and Muslim world, you know, and there's no question about that. And yeah, so I think it's possible, and I think it's necessary, and I think yeah, I encourage everybody to be active and mobilized towards that end, you know, because otherwise the scenario I painted of more of the same but only worse, you know, is not a very happy thing to look forward to. And the vested powers are invested in this thing, you know, politically, geostrategically, economically, you know, but those who are not vested in this and have the most to lose, but also the most to gain from it, I would argue. So, yeah, thank you. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Toufic. And I noticed that we've gone a couple minutes over, so apologies for that. I have one final question from Brendan McSharry, who I know that you're close with, and thank you, Brendan, for helping facilitate this webinar. So I'll make the exception there. So thank you very much. Brendan finally asked, how might a failing Israeli economy dampen Israeli settlement expansion and West Bank control?
Interesting question, Brendan. Thank you for the question. You know, obviously they would need to subsidize the settlement project, you know, with other means, but can they mobilize those resources? I don't know. We'd have to see what their channels of revenue are. But certainly that's something that could, I mean, we saw clearly with the first Bush administration that loan guarantees played an important part in helping the settlement project. And when that tap was turned off by Bush 1, when he was trying to force the Israelis to come to the table at Madrid, I think, it was a powerful form of leverage. So that certainly could play an important role. But the question is economic. I don't know. Israel's economy has changed a little bit. You know, it needs to be studied. I'm not an entire expert on it, but a lot of it comes from these military sales. And military sales are between states, right? It's not like you or me who's buying a weapon. It's like somebody who's buying millions of dollars because they want to, you know, whatever, buy a fleet of suicide drones, you know, which we saw Azerbaijan do, and it made a huge difference when they took on the Armenians, you know, and now all of a sudden those suicide drones are hot potatoes, you know. Are you going to be able to stop that sale? I mean, and who would stop it? I don't know. I mean, can you? The economy is more than that, obviously, and I don't want to simplify it. But what would result? What we have seen is Israel. I think, you know, I think there is an element that, because there is a bit of a pushback on this surveillance technology business, because it went to such an extreme level where you have the Dubai prince spying on his ex-wife because she's sleeping with who knows who, you know, and I mean, or it's a drug lord in Mexico who's buying this technology, or the Saudis are taking, you know, I don't want to get anyone in trouble on this conversation, but the point is the pushback is, you know, people on the ground are not particularly happy about the, you know, the sort of brave new world that we're coming into. And I'm not sure elites are entirely happy about it either, but at the same time, maybe they still need that technology. So anyway, I mean, that's just all about a bit of speculation about would economic decline in Israel affect the settlement enterprise? Yes, it would. It would. There's no question about it. And not just the settlement, yes, it certainly would. There's no question about that. So, and in that sense, there is a form of leverage there that you might be able to say, you know, that might be able to be used. And in fact, you see activists attempting this specifically when they talk about boycott, divestment, and sanctions and things like this of Israel. But at the end of the day, that the BDS movement, you know, it's one thing to not buy Israeli, I don't know what, fish and chips or whatnot. It's another thing to get your government not to buy suicide drones, right? And especially if it's a government that's not a democratic one or accountable, so to speak. So this is what's interesting here. And it kind of relates to Nathan's questions, because resolving Israel-Palestine is very much embedded in the strength and level of organization of democratic forces, I would argue, and liberal or more progressive forces around the world, you know, and wherever we see those forces weak or disorganized or fragmented, there's much more of a space for, you know, dictatorships to make alliances with other dictatorships and to make alliances with Israel. And we see that. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Toufic, and thank you very much for all the questions. It's been much appreciated and a very insightful evening. So thank you very much for spending that with us today. Team Global and International Perspective would just like to thank everyone, as well as Toufic, for coming on this evening. It's much appreciated. Toufic, do you have any parting words that you'd like to share with the audience?
I wish I could say something, you know, that would just make it all go away, but it's not. But you know, I think, yeah, we should avoid romantic thinking. We should be realists. There's a lot of hard work that needs to go into changing the situation, and we need to do that, I would argue, because actually the longer term costs, if those longer term trends keep on happening, it's going to be much, much worse. So yeah, take your pick.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, I hope everyone has a lovely evening. And thanks once again to Toufic. And yes, I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bless.